Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a preview to our ClassicsToday.com insider feature about Bruno Walter's 10 best recordings. Now, we've talked a lot about Bruno Walter. I did a video on the big Bruno Walter box, all 77 fun-filled CDs of it, and I've talked about his importance before in terms of his role in enlightening me and hopefully many others as to the truth of performance practice and the nonsense that was being pushed by folks like Roger Norrington and others of their ilk about what music really sounded like. And there's tons and tons and tons of evidence. I'm going to go through a little of it just because it's fun to talk about again in this context. But I want to broaden that, in terms of Walter's significance as an artist in this preview, and ask anybody who has yet to subscribe to ClassicsToday.com, please consider it. There's a link down there, and you can see his 10 best recordings and the 10 best recordings of dozens, and I mean dozens, of other conductors that we've been talking about in these regular preview selection video type things. So where are we with Bruno Walter? Well, Bruno Walter was born in 1876, and he died, 1962 or something like that? I don't even remember. The early 1960s. That is a very interesting period, because this is the period in which, theoretically, to hear the original instrument people tell you, there was this enormous transition between the early playing style, especially using no vibrato and using who knows what else before electricity, and modern playing. And that thesis is complete and total bullshit. And Bruno Walter is one of the conductors who proves it to us, who tells us this. And he tells it to us in the most wonderful way. So let's start with this. And then I want this one fact and the evidence for it. And then I want to just broaden the discussion a little bit about his importance as an avatar of musical tradition, of historical continuity, of the fact that the period instrument people would like us to believe that there's this huge rupture in the way things used to sound and the way they sound now. And, it's such crap. It's so funny. And people believe it, and I just, wow. Anyway, let's get to the evidence, shall we? I have right here, first let's listen to the thesis as proposed by Sir Roger Norrington, the worst conductor of the 20th and 21st century. Here we are. He's talking about, in the booklets, to his recording of Mahler's Ninth Symphony. And he writes as follows. This live performance of Mahler's Ninth, made at a single concert in September 2008, is perhaps the first for 70 years which has sought to recreate the sound world which Mahler would have taken for granted when he wrote the symphony in 1909/10. The previous performance with a similar sound was a famous live recording made by EMI engineers in the Vienna Musikverein in January 1938. Bruno Walter, Mahler's assistant and friend, was conducting the Vienna Philharmonic only weeks before he fled the city and the German Anschluss. Walter's performance marked the end of an era. It was the last time that any Mahler was played on German soil for 7 years. That's not true, by the way. That's another fact Norrington gets wrong. It was the last recording of an orchestra that still played with the great tradition of the 19th century. And it was the last time that any orchestra could be heard playing with pure tone. For, difficult though it is for all of us to imagine today, surrounded as we are with constant vibrato, steady tone in orchestras was simply the norm for Brahms, Wagner, Bruckner, and Mahler, as it had been for Bach, Mozart, and for Beethoven in the centuries before. Now that is a whopper of a statement, isn't it? That orchestral playing had not changed until after 1938. And before that, it was all the same. I mean, you should read that and every alarm bell in your body should go off immediately. But how to prove it? How to prove that Norrington was just a witless phony? Well, maybe not a witless phony, maybe a clever fox of a phony. One way or another, he was a phony, a snake oil salesman. And Bruno Walter himself tells us. It's worth pointing out also that, Bruno Walter hated that performance of Mahler's Ninth. It is terrible. It's absolutely terrible. It's horribly played. It sounds lousy. The orchestra is all over the place. And Walter said so. So we also know that. But we don't have to go there. That's a different issue. That's a Mahler 9 question. And we can deal with that in its appropriate place. In fact, I have. Now let's listen to Bruno Walter in an interview that was published. It was out there. It was on Philips Records. And it's included in the big Bruno Walter box, where he does an interview in 1960, talking about his life and his return to Vienna after the war and all of this stuff that's going on. And he's giving concerts with the Vienna Philharmonic at the time of the interview in 1960. And this is what Bruno Walter has to say. He says, quote, "I saw Vienna for the first time in 1897. I had an engagement then in the small municipal theater in Bratislava. I came from Breslau, went to Bratislava because I wanted to be in charge. They were the most paltry terms, but I felt that there what I said would be as first conductor. Bratislava was 1.5 hours from Vienna at that time. I went by boat down the Danube to Bratislava, but when I was in Vienna, I finally heard the Philharmonic for the first time. For me, this was a life-altering impression because it was this sound of the orchestra that I have experienced ever since I have the feeling. This is the way an orchestra should sound, the way it should play. I had never heard the beauty, this calmness of the sound, that sort of glissando, the manner of vibrato, the string sound, the blend of woodwinds with the strings, with the brass, the balance of the brass in combination with the percussion, contributing together to the overall sonority of the orchestra. For me, this impression was definitive. And now I would like to anticipate a point and tell you this. This sound, 1897, is the same today. This is 1960. There is not a single man left from that time, as you can imagine. In the early 50s, after that terrible period, I was in America, and I met up with the Vienna Philharmonic in Edinburgh to take part in the festival. And it was a touching reunion to play with them after such a long separation. And when they began to play, it was the same sound. And even now, when I made music with them and began rehearsing Schubert, it was the same sound that had given me such delight in 1897. What this is can only be called tradition. Here is a vibrant city expressing its musicality through the people assembled there in that orchestra. The musical culture has been expressed in Vienna, especially in this very specific local form. This is the sound of Vienna. Yes, thank you, Maestro Walter. So, what do we know? We know that the Vienna Philharmonic played with vibrato, a particular kind that was characteristic, that characterized the sound of that orchestra in 1897, because that's what vibrato does. It characterizes the timbre of string sound, and they hadn't changed in 1960, when nobody, not even Roger Norrington, would argue that orchestras were playing with what he calls constant vibrato, which also doesn't exist and is a misnomer and isn't true, but that's a whole nother question again, more specific. So Bruno Walter tells us that Roger Norrington is full of hooey. Let's be nice and call it that. But there's more to this, and that's what I want to say in just sort of talking about his importance. You see, the period instrument people, as I said earlier, would like us to believe that music history is full of ruptures, of periods when things sounded radically different from what they do today. And in some respects they may have, because of course instrument construction was different and the training of musicians was different. There were many differences, that is true. That is true. But the corporate sound of the orchestra, as we know it today, Bruno Walter is telling us, at least for Vienna, and ergo, for everybody else too, that had that history and that tradition, was relatively unchanged over a period of 60, 70 years. So if we know that, then we know that it should have been relatively unchanged for however much longer we want to go back. That's logic. I understand there's not evidence, but remember, the hip people, the historically informed people, also have no evidence. You see, the argument for rupture is a very convenient argument because we have now, and we have no idea what things sounded like back then. No idea whatsoever. But Bruno Walter tells us what they sounded like back then because he was there. And in a very specific way, he tells us, well, like the way they make glissandos, the way they do vibrato, it's the same. It's the same now, and we see what they're doing now as what it was then. So at least there, for this position, we have real evidence, even though we don't have recordings. And there's tons and tons of evidence about the use of vibrato in the Vienna Philharmonic in the 19th century. So we don't need to rely just on Bruno Walter. But this is a very, very important and interesting point in a general sense, this idea of continuity and tradition. And it has a lot to do with the way he performed music of the classical period. In talking about Mozart, Walter had a very interesting philosophy. He gave an introduction, which is in the big box, to his performance of Mozart's G minor symphony, which he waited a very, very long time to perform. I think he said he was like 50 before he dared attempt it. He regarded it as a work of high tragedy, a richly expressive, gripping, and emotionally wrenching piece. And his argument was, he said, a lot of people thought that Mozart was a sort of Rococo classicist. In the 19th century, he's talking about, the later Romantics. They regarded Mozart as something sort of cute and quaint and pretty and sugary and nice and, But he didn't see him that way. He said Mozart was Mozart. The fact that Mozart was a composer of the classical period or had elements of the Rococo style is irrelevant because Mozart was a genius. And geniuses, according to Bruno Walter, are timeless, completely timeless. The idea that Mozart should be made to sound like just another example of a trend or a period or a concatenation of performance practice rules and orthodoxies would have been appalling to Bruno Walter because of what I just said, because Mozart was a unique genius. He sounded like Mozart, and the elements that made him a genius, the elements that made Mozart sound like Mozart, that make his music so specific, so expressive, so gripping, so valid in performance to us today, are completely timeless and independent of the period in which he composed those works. And that is a very, very important, I think, idea. Because here we're talking about quality, the quality of the music, our ability to realize the music, the ability of the interpreters to interpret the music, the reason it still speaks to us today, that quality of timelessness. And the period instrument folk are really trying to reduce music of that period simply to a formula, to a series of formulas. And in a way, there's a great hypocrisy in what they're doing. Because, if you take somebody like John Eliot Gardner or Nicholas Harnoncourt, they did some wonderful stuff, and they did some wonderful Mozart. They did. But the reason they did is because they were ignoring the essential thesis of period instrument performance, which is that, you feed the right practice into the bin, and out comes Mozart. Not at all. To the extent that their performances of Mozart are great, they're great because we have now what they didn't have back then, which is conductors who dictate exactly what the performance is going to be, not a group of people who are supposedly programmed to perform in a certain style, and they're just going to do it without any input from any single guiding intelligence. And so, Walter's emphasis on two things, two qualities which permeate his performances. One, the continuity of tradition, the idea that, yes, there will have been changes. There necessarily changes over time. But the sound, what we hear in music that we know, in music that is part of this tradition, is not going to be huge. And there is no evidence for it being as great and as exaggerated as the period instrument people make it. Because remember, they're out to show that the difference was vast, to justify what they're doing. That's how they earn their bread and butter, by saying, oh my God, it sounded so different. Only we know how different. Well, none of that is true. None of that is demonstrable. It's all just theoretical folderol. And we have conductors. I mean, Walter was one. There was Toscanini. There was Monteur. I've talked about them before. There was Kusevitsky. There was, a whole slew of them who were born in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. There's Ansermet, who lived to make recordings up until the stereo era. And they never had any problem with the way orchestras were playing. They never screamed, no, stop with the vibrato. That didn't happen until 1990, when all the conductors who really knew what these orchestras sounded like were dead. And the latest generation of people who had no clue what any of those orchestras really sounded like were able to impose their idea on the sound of modern orchestras and to turn their backs on the tradition of performance practice that musicians have treasured and been proud of and have been at such pains to try and preserve as those traditions were passed down from teacher to student and so forth. So that's one issue that Bruno Walter has, tradition. And the other is the individuality of musical genius, the timelessness of musical genius, the idea that an artist, a performance, a great work of musical art cannot be reduced to a prescription of specific performance practices. And those prescriptions, whether they're right or whether they're wrong, I mean, some of them indeed may be correct. That's not the point. The point is that is not where the greatness of the music lies, and therefore that is not where its affect, where its expressive point and force and power and glory reside. The greatness resides in the timelessness of the composer's genius. Now, this is not provable either, obviously. This is an aesthetic position that one may take. But I think it's a very, very admirable position and a very interesting position and a very valid one as well, because we still play Mozart today. And there were a million other similar composers in Mozart's day, presumably all doing the same things with the same performance practice, who we do not play. And some of them were quite good, but we don't listen to them. And so there is something extra in some of these great composers, and that something extra is what Bruno Walter was trying to express in his performances. And that's the reason we still listen to his performances, I would argue, because that is indeed what he managed to express in the best of them, And of course, and most, I have to be honest, I mean, let's say, most of the better period instrument performers would agree with this statement that I'm about to make wholeheartedly. To the extent we still listen to their great performances, it is not because they have just fed in a bunch of, witless prescriptions, as Roger Norrington was so wont to do, but it's because they realized the genius inherent in the music, which would have manifested whether they were playing period instruments or not. So the bottom line is that whether you do it that way or not, whether you believe in the historically informed performance movement or not, that's not what makes the music enjoyable or valid or powerful or legitimate or great. Not a bit. It doesn't matter. And so I really think Bruno Walter is a wonderful example of why we can, how to understand this, how to come to grips with this, how to how to provide an antidote for the really exaggerated and unknowable and undemonstrable claims of those who say that their way is the authentic way, is the right way. The worst offender, of course, was Roger Norrington, who fooled, generations of music lovers into believing his claptrap, and I think did immeasurable harm to our understanding of what makes great music great. I really believe that. I think he was a toxic force in late 20th century music. I don't believe that's true of the historically informed performance movement generally, only in its most malevolent manifestations. But Bruno Walter is there to tell us the truth. And that is why we still listen to him, and that is why I hope you will hop on over to classicstoday.com and take a look at my list of Bruno Walter's 10 best recordings. Thank you so much for joining me. Keep on listening, friends, and take care.